pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1847 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. Speaking of the brave veterans, in this episode I'm going to talk about the tunnels of Ho Chi. This is in honor of my good buddies over there in the 25th Infantry Division, better known as the Tropic Lightning, and especially those guys who served in the Wolfhounds in the 27th Infantry. They didn't realize it at the time, but when they set up the headquarters of the 25th Division in the Ho Chi area, it was right on top of a huge complex of tunnels. Many people are familiar with those tunnels because it seemed like the NVA and the Viet Cong would just pop up from nowhere and start shooting at you. It was almost ghostly. And then you had those super brave guys who would go down into those tunnels hunting the bad guys. They were known as tunnel rats. I believe every tunnel rat deserves a medal of some sort, at least maybe a silver star. Many of them got the silver stars. It was a tough thing. In this episode, I'm going to share with you some information about the tunnels back during the Vietnam War, how they got started, how big they were, and then I'm going to share with you what they've done with those tunnels. You have to hand it to those Vietnamese. They are very sharp people. I realized that when I was in Vietnam, seeing them close up. Now, 50 years later, things haven't changed. I never cease to be impressed with what the Vietnamese people do. One of the things they do that is impressive is they're making money from the Ho Chi tunnels. First of all, I'm going to share a story with you that appeared on the History Channel that gives some details about these tunnels. Then I'm going to share with you a story from none other than the Vietnam Express International website, which, just for your information, is nothing more than a commie propaganda rag. They put out some good news every once in a while. In the VN Express International story titled, Dig Deep, Saigon House Hides War Tunnel, it seems that a gentleman by the name of Nguyen Van Tran is making money from the tunnels that were constructed under his house. I believe that's a cool thing to do. The war's over. You might as well make a little money off of showing people what those tunnels actually look like. For you, I have created a slideshow showing what Nguyen Van Tran has done at his house in Ho Chi to make it into a showplace of tunnels used during the Vietnam War. I encourage you to go to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. There you will see this 10-image cavalcade of pictures of the tunnel today and what Nguyen Van Tran has done to make it into a tourist attraction. Also, it will show the inside of the tunnel that was built under his house that housed NVA and VC fighters and equipment during the war. I think you'll be amazed at what they did underground. That's what typically happens when you have a superpower going to war against a guerrilla enemy. They cannot face the superpower head-on on the battlefield, so they have to do what they have to do. One of the things they did was build tunnels. They were not used just against the Americans. They were started back in the French days. That'll come out in the History Channel piece I'm going to share with you. Again, you are invited to go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com, episode 1847. Check out the slideshow I have provided just for you so you can see those tunnels today. They look as good today as they did back when they were being used. First, let's take a look at the History Channel story about the tunnels. It was titled Ho Chi Tunnels, put out by the editors of the History Channel. Dateline, the History Channel. In order to combat better supplied American and South Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War, communist guerrilla troops known as VC dug tens of thousands of miles of tunnels, including an extensive network running underneath the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon. Soldiers used these underground routes to house troops, transport communications and supplies, lay booby traps, and mount surprise attacks, after which they could disappear underground to safety. To combat these guerrilla tactics, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces trained soldiers known as tunnel rats to navigate the tunnels in order to detect booby traps and enemy troop presence. Now part of a Vietnam War national park in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon, the Cu Chi tunnels have become a popular tourist attraction. Communist forces began digging a network of tunnels under the jungle terrain of South Vietnam in the late 1940s during their War of Independence from French colonial authority. Tunnels were often dug by hand, only a short distance at a time. As the United States increasingly escalated its military presence in Vietnam in support of a non-communist regime in South Vietnam, beginning in the early 1960s, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops gradually expanded the tunnels. At its peak during the Vietnam War, the network of tunnels in the Cu Chi district linked VC support bases over a distance of some 150 miles, from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. As the United States relied heavily on aerial bombing, North Vietnamese and VC troops went underground in order to survive and continue their guerrilla tactics against the much better supplied enemy. In heavily bombed areas, people spent much of their life underground, and the Cu Chi tunnels grew to house entire underground villages, in effect living quarters, kitchens, ordnance factories, hospitals, and bomb shelters. In some areas, there were even large theaters and music halls to provide diversion for the troops and their supporters. In addition to providing underground shelter, the Cu Chi tunnels served a key role during combat operations, including as a base for communist attacks against nearby Saigon. VC soldiers lurking in the tunnels set numerous booby traps for U.S. and South Vietnamese infantrymen, planting tripwires that would set off grenades or overturn boxes of scorpions or poisonous snakes onto the heads of enemy troops. To combat these guerrilla tactics, U.S. forces would eventually train some soldiers to function as so-called tunnel rats. These soldiers, usually of small stature, would spend hours navigating the cramped, dark tunnels to detect booby traps and scout for enemy troops. I would add this comment here. In addition to being small in stature, tunnel rats had to be large in another area of the anatomy that gives one a lot of courage. Continuing. In January 1966, some 8,000 U.S. and Australian troops attempted to sweep the Cu Chi district in a large-scale program of attacks dubbed Operation Crimp. After B-52 bombers dropped a large amount of explosives onto the jungle region, the troops searched the area for enemy activity but were largely unsuccessful, as most communist forces had disappeared into the network of underground tunnels. A year later, around 30,000 American troops launched Operation Cedar Falls, attacking the communist stronghold of Bien Duong province north of Saigon near the Cambodian border, an area known as the Iron Triangle, after hearing reports of a network of enemy tunnels there. After bombing attacks and the defoliation of rice fields and surrounding jungle areas with powerful herbicides known as Agent Orange and Agent Blue, U.S. tanks and bulldozers moved in to sweep the tunnels, driving out several thousand residents, many of them civilian refugees. It always happens in these wars. The civilians take the brunt of the misery. Just like in Dresden, Germany, where they bombed that city and killed tens of thousands of children and women. North Vietnamese and VC troops slipped back in within months of the sweep, and in early 1968, they would use the tunnels as a stronghold in their assault against Saigon during the Tet Offensive. In all, at least 45,000 Vietnamese men and women are said to have died defending the Cu Chi tunnels over the course of the Vietnam War. In the years following the fall of Saigon in 1975, the Vietnamese government preserved the Cu Chi tunnels and included them in a network of war memorial parks around the country. Visitors can now crawl through some of the safer areas of the tunnels, view command centers and booby traps, fire an AK-47 on a firing range, and even eat a meal featuring typical foods that soldiers living in the tunnels would have eaten. If you like dog meat, you'd probably like one of those meals. That is the story of the Cu Chi tunnels during the war, how they got constructed and what they were used for. Today, things have changed. Many of those tunnels have become tourist attractions. Let's take a look at the VN Express International story titled Dig Deep, Saigon House Hides War Tunnel. This is where the slideshow comes from that's on the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. This slideshow will highlight the home of Nguyen Van Tran. He's 55 years old. He was just a young child during the war. He was born in the house that was owned by a National Liberation Front sympathizer who volunteered to have tunnels dug under his house. Matter of fact, Nguyen Van Tran's father participated in digging the tunnels and transporting troops and supplies into Saigon so they could shoot up Americans and South Vietnamese. Let's take a look at this story that was submitted by none other than Quynh Tran, a writer for Vietnam Express International. Dateline, Cu Chi, Vietnam. A house in Saigon's Cu Chi district boasts a 30-meter-long secret tunnel where National Liberation Front guerrillas took shelter during the Vietnam War. The house belongs to Nguyen Van Tran. The 55-year-old said the tunnel system stored weapons used by the North Vietnamese troops and served as a hideout for National Liberation Front guerrillas beneath Saigon, renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the war's end in 1975. Tran is the youngest child of 10 children born to former NLF guerrilla Nguyen Van Ten, in charge of transporting weapons by road to enter Saigon. The tunnel is about a meter high, and soldiers had to crouch to move along it. It was dug by Tran and his comrades during 1955 and took over 10 years to complete. Those guys had a lot of patience over there. They dug little by little at night using hoes and shovels, then secretly brought the leftover soil to hide elsewhere, Tran recalled. The tunnel under his house is 30 meters long, leading from the garden to inside the house. Its walls are covered in clay mixed with highly durable laterite, able to withstand the destructive force of light bombardment. At the end of the tunnel under Tran's house lies a 3-meter square secret vault for soldiers and weapons. Tran Hai Phong, commander of the Saigon Gia Dinh military region, took shelter between 1967 and 1968 ahead of the Tet Offensive in the tunnel. The Tet Offensive was launched on January 30th, the first day of Vietnam's Lunar New Year in 1968, and saw over 80,000 soldiers from the North and Vietnam National Liberation Front launch surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts throughout southern Vietnam. They don't mention in the story that 52,000 of those 80,000 soldiers were killed graveyard dead in a matter of days after the start of the Tet Offensive. Yet, they continued on, building more tunnels, fighting more and more. What does this tell you about our decision to go to war against the Vietnamese? Pardon me, it's so easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. One of the pictures in the slideshow shows Tran exiting the tunnel right next to the barn by his house. In the past, the area was, of course, camouflaged with straw. Otherwise, the whole family would have been dead. Another picture in the slideshow shows the tunnel vent disguised as a termite mound. Since the war, though, Tran's family has made it bigger to boost the visitor experience. Also to increase paid attendance at his display. Also in the slideshow is the picture of Tran's very nice 100 square meter house completed in the 1960s with a red tile roof and brick tile yard. Since the war, Tran has built another home next door for convenience, meaning he wanted his home open for visitors. When you look at the picture of Tran's home, you realize that his father had to be a man of means because it is a very nice house. Something else that appeals to me as a Floridian who has to cut a lot of grass, they've tiled the entire front yard with beautiful red tiles. I think that's a good idea. I might consider laying a few of those red tiles in my yard. Another picture shows Tran in his house the same as it was back then. It shows furniture, wardrobes, beds, and a counter, same as it was back then. Some other items such as guns, sewing machines, and an ox cart have been assigned to museums. Tran said this, "These items are associated with my father's revolutionary activity and should be carefully preserved." There's also a picture in the slideshow that shows a wall in the house with images dating back to the war. Another picture shows Tran's father on top of the ox cart he used to transport weapons. The photo was framed by the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City and given to his family. The last picture in the slideshow shows a preserved part of his yard that is littered with discarded U.S. bomb shells dropped in Cu Chi district, along with the cart used to conceal weapons. Tran said his house welcomes many visitors and veterans. After you look at the slideshow, I think you'll appreciate that Nguyen Van Tran and the Vietnamese government have preserved some of these remnants of the Vietnam War. I think it's important that we look at these things, remember them, and realize that the last thing we want to do in the future is have a war where you're fighting one side that lives in tunnels. It is not a good idea. Why don't we all study the past so that we won't make the same mistakes in the future? Let's hope anyway. Again, don't miss the slideshow over at the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com, in episode 1847. I think you'll enjoy it. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1847 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?